Consider yourself a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt who has just received the most unsettling task of your profession. On the marble slab in front of you is the pharaoh's wife. But this isn't a regular mummification. You've been commanded to preserve her body in a way that defies every sacred tradition you've ever known. And the reason makes your blood run cold. This wasn't fiction. Intimate customs were so severe in ancient Egypt that they would traumatize contemporary minds. You believe you are knowledgeable about Egyptian culture. The enigmatic pyramids, the majestic pharaohs, and the glittering treasures. Here's what they don't teach you in school. The sexual practices of ancient Egypt were so harsh that the evidence was actually concealed by Victorian archaeologists. Where religious celebrations devolved into week-long orgies of violence and sexual mayhem, and where royal children were abused horribly by their own families. Everything you believe to be true about one of the greatest civilizations in history will be called into question by what I'm going to show you. For more than a century, museums all across the world attempted to conceal the evidence since the reality about Egyptian private behaviors is so unsettling. Along the verdant banks of the Nile between 3130 BCE, the Egyptians created customs that would astound even the most progressive modern brains. This was more than merely a religious event or a matter of personal enjoyment. It was about cosmic control, divine authority, and the systematic use of sexuality as a weapon of political subjugation. The pharaohs weren't just kings. The fertility of the Nile, the prosperity of harvests, and the longevity of Egyptian civilization itself were all thought to be directly under the influence of these living deities. As a result, there was tremendous pressure to demonstrate divine might in ever more extreme ways. The proof comes from temple inscriptions that tourists never see, papyrus texts describing practices too explicit for museum exhibits, and archaeological findings that Victorian scholars deliberately concealed from public view. When 19th-century archaeologists first uncovered explicit imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they were so scandalized that they either destroyed the material or locked it away in secret collections. Egyptian society operated on the principle that sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every intimate act had the potential to be a sacred rite. Every sexual position, every climax, every dialogue with the gods, and every kind of supplication. The lines separating intimacy and worship, as well as between religious obligation and personal enjoyment, totally vanished in this culture. But this celestial sexuality came with a nasty side. Children from wealthy households were ensnared in a system that viewed their bodies as sacred property. Systematic sexual abuse of domestic slaves was not only acceptable but also required by religion. And when things went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood or crops failed, the sexual practices became increasingly desperate and violent. The finding that changed everything happened not in some dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they noticed something that would haunt Egyptology for the ensuing century. The boy king's genitals were missing, not damaged, not decaying, but surgically removed using the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun wasn't alone, as additional royal mummies were investigated. Utilizing increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed indications of genital removal or modification. Some had been totally castrated. Others exhibited indications of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of extraneous materials. The tomb of an unidentified royal from the 18th dynasty yielded the most startling find. In addition to missing genitalia, his mummies showed proof that the removal had been done while he was still alive. Medical research of the bone structure and tissue remains suggested this was not a punishment or accident, but a purposeful religious procedure. Texts from ancient Egypt started to make unsettling sense. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, descriptions of preparing the body for eternal service to the gods, and instructions for changing the deceased to ensure correct spiritual function in the next world. The ramifications were astounding. That if the Egyptians were routinely changing the genitals of their dead, what did this imply about their ideas about sexuality in the human body? Were these modifications purely post-mortem, or did they reflect practices conducted on the living as well? But perhaps most alarming of all was the deliberate way Victorian archaeologists had suppressed this evidence. Early Egyptologists did not simply disregard graphic sexual imagery or indications of genital alteration. They aggressively repressed it, removing artifacts from public view and editing details out of official reports. The actual scope of Egyptian sexual activities has been hidden for more than a century, not by ancient concealment but rather by Victorian prudishness and contemporary shame that refused to acknowledge what the evidence plainly shone. However, archaeologists discovered much more than simply the missing genitalia. The Egyptian sexual control system operated through a complex hierarchy that defined every aspect of intimate. At the summit were the pharaohs whose sexual performance was seen as essential to Egypt's survival. Nobles underneath them, even clerics, felt great pressure to demonstrate their value through sexual demonstrations of religious devotion. At the bottom were domestic slaves, notably children who faced systemic mistreatment that wasn't only accepted but required by religion. Born into this system, royal children experienced an especially horrible fate. Ancient Egyptian records explain how elite families would consecrate their youngest offspring to temple service, where they would be instructed in sexual techniques from an early age. These kids, some as young as 6 or 7, were taught that their bodies belonged to the gods rather than to themselves. The training was rigorous and harsh. Children learnt precise positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods for maintaining arousal during extended religious practices. They were taught to disconnect from their own physical experiences, to consider their bodies as instruments rather than personal property. Medical papyri described the physical toll this training imposed on youthful bodies. Children developed persistent injuries from forced flexibility training. Their growth was often inhibited by poor nourishment designed to maintain childish proportions preferred by adult clientele. Many died from internal injuries or infections related to premature intimate interaction. But the abuse spread far beyond temple training. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely exploited their domestic slaves for pleasure, with youngsters being particularly coveted for their supposed purity and malleability. According to legal records, child slaves could be bought and sold especially for sex, with their worth based on factors including age, looks, and level of training. The psychological impact was devastating. Those who survived to adulthood displayed symptoms that contemporary psychologists would identify as serious trauma. They had difficulties forming normal relationships, often became sexually compulsive or completely withdrawn, and usually died young from what ancient writings euphemistically called shattered hearts. The most unsettling aspect was probably how Christian theology was used to justify this behavior. The highest kind of worship, according to priests, is sexual service to the gods. That kids selected for this kind of service were blessed rather than harmed. Families were encouraged to feel honored when their children were selected for temple responsibilities, even when they realized the true nature of what would happen. An additional level of terror was introduced by the economic aspect. Archaeological evidence suggests a 73% mortality rate among temple children, with medical examination revealing procedures that took up to 6 hours to complete. Rich patrons funded a systematic abuse industry that persisted for millennia by paying high rates for access to child slaves. But if you think that's the worst thing Egyptian children endured, you're not ready for what's coming next. This systematic abuse was nothing compared to what happened on the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most notorious religious event. What I'm about to reveal includes actions so extreme that when early archaeologists discovered evidence, they literally burned the documents rather than translate them for public consumption. What I'm about to convey will make everything you just heard seem like a children's story. The next practice combines religious worship with sexual violence on a scale that would shock even modern listeners. It involved an entire civilization plunging into week-long orgies of mayhem. And the archaeological evidence confirms that really happened just as the ancient sources describe. Before we delve into the most disturbing portion, press that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it amazing that individuals all throughout the world have an interest in the darkest periods of human history. The Feast of Drunkenness represented the extreme apex of Egyptian sexual fanaticism, an annual festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor that converted the entire civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, and religious turmoil. What started as a celebration of divinity, femininity developed into something that would be deemed a crime against humanity by modern standards. The festival's origins lay in Egyptian mythology, notably the narrative of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. According to tradition, the gods had to flood Egypt with beer laced with crimson ochre to make Sekhmet think she was ingesting blood, causing her to become so inebriated that she forgot her violent mission and changed into the milder Hathor. This myth became the framework for an annual celebration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into a state of divinity possession. However, the celebration was much more than just getting drunk. Participants felt that in their drunken state, they were vehicles for the gods themselves, free to act on any impulse without moral or legal consequence. The preparation began months in advance. Temple authorities would brew huge volumes of beer, often adding hallucinogenic substances derived from lotus blossoms and other plants. The final concoction was more than merely intoxicating. It created hallucinations and severely lowered inhibitions. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling possessed by supernatural forces. Normal social norms vanished entirely once the celebration got underway. Masters had sex with slaves in public squares. Married ladies abandoned their families to join nomadic bands of revelers. Youngsters witnessed graphic intimate actions and frequently took part in them themselves. For 7 days and nights, the entire civilization sank into chaos. Even contemporary readers are shocked by the scenes described in ancient writings. Cities would be overrun by groups of drunken Egyptians who broke into houses and had the occupants join them in celebrating. Group abuse of women was practiced under the pretext of religious communion. Men competed to see who could sustain sexual excitement for the longest times when completely intoxicated. As extreme as the sexuality was the violence. Participants would attack each other with sexual fury, biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds that were regarded indications of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries caused by violent sexual actions. Others were trampled by swarms of intoxicated celebrants passing through narrow streets. Everything was made even more unsettling by the religious explanation. Priests taught that every act performed during the celebration was by definition holy as participants were possessed by divine spirits. Religious communion evolved from abuse. Violence became sacred sacrifice. Child abuse became divine favor. Foreign visitors left stories that indicate international horror at these celebrations. Mesopotamian diplomats cited the festival as proof that Egyptians were barbarians disguised as a sophisticated civilization. Some nations hesitated to send ambassadors to Egypt during festival periods, fearful about their safety and moral contamination. The aftermath of the festival was just as devastating as the event itself. Participants typically had no memory of what they had done while intoxicated, leading to psychological trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions. When family members discovered what their relatives had done during the celebration, families fell apart. Children born 9 months following the celebration faced stigma as offspring of divine possession rather than regular conception. The economic impact was tremendous. For a week, entire cities would be closed while the populace indulged in drunken revelry. Government operations came to a complete standstill, trade stopped, and agricultural labor stopped. The cost in lost productivity was tremendous. But pharaohs considered it a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance. The celebration had political objectives as well. It permitted the Egyptian system to retain strict hierarchy for the majority of the year by acting as a safety valve for societal tensions. Citizens may rebel against authority, masters could be humiliated by slaves, and social standards could be violated, but only during this carefully controlled moment of turmoil. Archaeological evidence shows the extreme nature of these festivities. Specialized chambers intended for group sexual activities with characteristics that imply they were utilized for violent and dehumanizing behaviors are discovered during excavations of temple sites. The physical evidence matches the distressing stories left by ancient scribes. The systematic breakdown of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on the religious customs of Egypt. The conflict between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a catastrophe that finally devastated both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt obligated to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to keep legitimacy with their subjects, but their Greek sensibilities were appalled by the severe sexual behaviors they encountered. Cleopatra attempted to modify the Feast of Drinking, shortening its lifespan and enforcing restrictions on the violence and public sexuality. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Priests from Egypt contended that altering the festival would offend the gods and bring cosmic disaster. They cited economic issues, military setbacks, and natural calamities as proof that the gods were already upset with foreign meddling in sacred traditions. The issue reached its peak during the reign of Cleopatra II, who faced the impossible job of satisfying both Egyptian religious expectations and Roman political demands. Egyptian sexual customs appalled Roman observers, who saw them as signs of savagery and moral deterioration. But Egyptian priests feared revolt if traditional holidays were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's answer was to present a more subdued public image to Roman audiences while creating secret versions of the celebrations for Egyptian religious leaders. No one was content with this compromise, and it fostered a culture of hypocrisy that threatened both Roman political power and Egyptian religious authority. The torture of children became even more systematic during this period as desperate rulers tried to prove their adherence to Egyptian traditions while hiding the evidence from Roman inspection. Child slaves were trafficked in bigger numbers, their abuse perpetrated in secret quarters that Roman officials were not allowed to enter. The psychological toll on Egyptian society was immense. Generations of youngsters had been raised in a system that normalized sexual violence and religious extremism. When external pressure drove modifications to these customs, many Egyptians experienced a type of cultural trauma. They have lost not simply religious traditions, but their entire framework for interpreting sexuality and divine relationship. The final collapse came with the Roman conquest in 30 BC. Augustus Caesar was horrified by what his men discovered in Egyptian temples and immediately ordered the suppression of sexual religious practices. Roman soldiers destroyed explicit artwork, burned religious texts, and murdered priests who refused to renounce customary practices. But the Romans didn't merely suppress Egyptian sexual habits, they systematically erased evidence of their existence. Temples were devoid of explicit decorations. Papi outlining sexual rituals were burned, and even architectural elements intended for religious sexuality were destroyed or hidden. The children who had been stuck in this system faced an especially sad destiny. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned for sexual service that they couldn't adapt to normal life. Roman records describe previous temple children who died by suicide rather than face a world where their only perceived value had been eliminated. The survivors carried trauma that affected Egyptian society for generations. The systemic sexual abuse had formed patterns of conduct and belief that couldn't be simply removed by political conquest. Roman governors reported continuous problems with kid sex cults, subterranean trafficking networks, and religious movements aimed at restoring conventional practices in private. However, not all of the evidence could be destroyed, not even by the Romans. The largest cover-up in archaeological history was created by Victorian archaeologists in response to what they left behind. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices began not with ancient conspiracies, but with Victorian moral sensitivities that couldn't bear the archaeological truth. Explorers in the 19th century confronted a cultural crisis that influenced Egyptology for the following 150 years when they first came across graphic sexual imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples. The pattern was established early. When Giovanni Belzoni uncovered explicitly sexual wall murals in the tomb of C in 1817, he promptly ordered them covered with plaster rather than documented. His published narrative depicted the tomb as containing magnificent religious scenes while completely omitting the graphic sexual elements that covered several chambers. This became typical practice throughout the Victorian era. The Egyptian Antiquity Service's founder, Auguste Marat, kept private collections of explicit artifacts that were never on public view. Entire categories of artifacts were confined to storage spaces that were only accessible by male experts. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was founded, the suppression wasn't confined to pictures. Victorian translators frequently removed entire chapters or substituted euphemistic terms for frank depictions of sexual material in ancient writings. The famous Ers's Papyrus, one of the most important medical writings from ancient Egypt, has around 40 sections dealing with sexual activities that weren't translated until the 1970s. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic destruction of evidence. Flender Petrie, a British archaeologist, freely acknowledged that he destroyed artifacts he deemed too offensive for public consumption. His diaries described burning papyri, shattering monuments, and rearing artifacts that portrayed sexual acts he couldn't bring himself to document. The cover-up extended to academic institutions. Universities declined to sponsor research into Egyptian sexuality, finding it inappropriate for intellectual study. Pupils who shown interest in these subjects faced discouragement or expulsion. Even when articles about sexual habits were supported by strong archaeological data, academic journals rejected them. Complex systems were created by museums to conceal sexual artifacts. The British Museum alone has around 2,800 suppressed Egyptian artifacts placed in restricted access rooms labeled only as miscellaneous ceramics or decorative objects. The Louvre was caught concealing recently found papyri from the public as recently as 2019. Even Wikipedia articles about these topics are mysteriously barred from editing. Visitors who specifically wish to view these things face bureaucratic obstacles designed to prevent casual curiosity. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York retains similar restrictions. Sanitized replicas of two murals with graphic sexual content that has been either covered or digitally erased are on show in their Egyptian galleries. Only researchers who can prove a valid academic need and consent to stringent secrecy rules can access the original artwork, which is kept in storage. This Victorian heritage still influences how the general public views ancient Egypt today. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions focus on political history, religious beliefs, and creative triumphs while completely neglecting the sexual practices that were important to Egyptian culture. The outcome is a sanitized version of history that bears little relation to the complicated and often unsettling reality of ancient Egyptian society. This ongoing concealment has caused significant gaps in public understanding about human sexuality, religious rituals, and social organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. The horrors buried in Egyptian tombs and scriptures illustrate how readily religious dedication can convert into systematic mistreatment when human sexuality turns into a tool of cosmic control. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization created and upheld practices that treated children as sexual property, normalized violence as a kind of religious devotion, and utilized intimacy as a weapon of political dominance. This look into history's concealed darkness has left you desiring to reveal more hidden realities. I've prepared another excursion into the shadows of the past that you won't desire to miss. Click on the video displaying on your screen now to uncover another shocking chapter that history sought to erase. And if you found this exploration as interesting as I did, press that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. There are a ton of untold tales that need to be shared, and these overlooked voices deserve to be heard.